question. Are you willing to use military force against Iran to protect Israel?
We have to understand that Israel is our most important ally in the Middle East. And we also understand that Iran poses a major threat to Israel, especially with their nuclear program. But before we consider going to war with Iran for the protection of Israel, we have to take into consideration our economic sanctions and diplomacy as being our number one options before we consider war. We also have to consider Israel's own right to their own defense, as well as the fact that if we do go to war, it has to be a very justifiable war for the American people. Considering our economic sanction policies, we know that they work. We've seen that throughout these international interlateral sanctions, we have seen Iran have to increase their spending by billions of dollars every year. The Council of Foreign Relations and other think tanks agree. We go to the most intelligent people in these specific areas and ask them, and their responses are to continue to utilize these diplomatic processes and to be able to elaborate and continue our encouragement of these sanctions and diplomatic negotiations before considering an option for war. But we also have to consider that Israel has their own right to defense. We also know that they have a very strong defense program. We don't need to control a sovereign nation, which is one of the most militarily powerful nations within their region. We've also know that we've put in a lot of money into aid for Israel. Within the past 4 years, we've been able to improve their defense, their military aid, and consultations with buying weapons. We are confident that Israel can protect themselves if necessary. But we also have to understand that this war is not a game. This is not something that we can pose, and if we do consider to go to war with Iran, we would have to be able to make it justifiable. After a decade of war in the Middle East, the American people are tired of having conflict there and are tired of the economic stresses that this will put on our economy. Before going to war, we have to make a very calculated decision, and therefore we understand how we can help Israel.
Israel is the United States' closest ally in the Middle East and a beacon of democracy and freedom in the region. The tumult in the Middle East has heightened Israel's security problems and has deteriorated relationships with Turkey and Egypt, a violent and highly unstable Syria, and a nuclear aspiring Iran, whose leadership is openly calling for Israel's annihilation. I believe that it is unacceptable for Iran to possess nuclear weapons capabilities. A nuclear-capable Iran will pose an existential threat to Israel, whose security is of vital U.S. national interest. As Iran's ballistic missile capacity improves, it will endanger Europe and eventually the continental United States. Unfortunately, the Democratic administration has made no progress in slowing Iran's nuclear weapons programs. In fact, the progress of the program is sped up today. Iran is on the cusp of nuclear weapons capabilities. Iran is enriching uranium at its fastest rate ever. It has installed and is operating more spinning centrifuges than ever. It is nearing completion of its fortified underground enrichment facility in Fordo. The Democratic administration has pushed forward sanctions on Iran. However, sanctions are not effective enough to deter Iran from pursuing nuclear programs. Sanctions are not ends in themselves. They are intended to persuade Iran to change course and abandon its nuclear program. President Obama deserves credit for pushing for a fourth round of international sanctions on Iran early in his term. But time has shown that existing sanctions have not led the Ayatollahs to abandon their nuclear aspirations. The Democratic administration has badly misunderstood the dynamics of the region. Instead of fostering stability and security, they have diminished U.S. authority and painted both Israel and ourselves into a corner. The president has explicitly stated that his policy is to create daylight between the United States and Israel, believing that this would earn us credit in the Arab world and somehow bring peace closer. The record proves otherwise. The key to negotiating a lasting peace is an Israel that knows it will be secure.
When we consider what my opponent brought up about the idea of Iran's developing nuclear program, we have to understand that the facts tell us that the United States' efforts in military sanctions and economic sanctions have actually produced benefits that have been able to protect the American as well as Israeli people. We've been able to halt the production, and as of right now, Iran is in no way at a nuclear-capable state of incapacity. We still have an estimated 1 year before they would be able to reach that point. That is 1 year of potential diplomatic negotiations, of foreign counseling, and of economic sanctions that could produce better results before we go to war. Before we consider beating the drums for a new call to war and action in the Middle East, we have to consider the other options that lay on the table, which my opponent seems to ignore. With their relationship with Russia, that is something that has to be handled with diplomatic negotiations before we blindly enter into a war with both Russia as well as Iran, which would definitely be a tragic incident for the American people as well as for our economy.
My opponent contends that sanctions cost Iran billions of dollars, and I completely agree. However, they also cost all the Middle Eastern countries and the United States millions of dollars and are crippling to the overall worldwide economy. Why would we ever use sanctions when they damage our own economy as well? There's no reason for this. Next, sanctions haven't worked since the rate at which uranium has been increasing by 3.5% each year since 2009. As we can see, sanctions are not effective and they hurt our own economy. This does not make any sense. Now let's go on to, my opponent was talking about how Israel has their own right to defense. And this is just absurd. I think that Israel won't complain if we go help them. Everyone appreciates help, and it's completely justifiable if we're defending one of our biggest allies in the entire world, undisputedly in the Middle East. Finally, she talked about negotiations and how we could use negotiations, and we have 1 year until Iran reaches capabilities. However, this is the exact reason why they have 3.5 increase of uranium because of these negotiations. Thank you.